that people set up, and that was normal behavior. So this isn't really that unusual. Some people, of course, feel that this is connected to what Antiochus did, Antiochus the Fourth, when he established a uh, horrible image um, in in the temple, literally in the Beit Hamikdash. That was the thing that kind of precipitated the the Maccabean revolt was that he just went too far. That King Nebuchadnezzar had gone too far. So I mean that King Antiochus had gone too far. So that what Nebuchadnezzar is doing is not really what he did, but what Antiochus did. Um, and again, Jews are part of the kingdom, and assumedly they're going to have to bow down to this statue.
Seizing the occasion, certain Chaldeans came forward to slander the Jews. They spoke up and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, gave an order that everyone who hears the horn, pipe, zithers, lyre, psaltery, bagpipe, and all types of instruments must fall down and worship the golden statue. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be thrown into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you appointed to administer the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those men pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your God or worship the statue of gold that you have set up."
Now, there's a couple things to point out, especially if you were not here last week, just to remind you again, we said these are the same, this is the other people that were with Daniel, though it doesn't mention Daniel. Like, so why is Daniel not included in this? Right? They badmouth three of them, but they didn't badmouth Daniel. So think about that. Think on that for a second. Daniel's not mentioned here. Okay. The other thing that's interesting is that it says the Chaldeans are doing this, and the Chaldeans are kind of like we mentioned. The Chaldeans are an ethnic group, but there also seem to be a caste within the Babylonian kingdom, which is again maybe they're like the inner circle. What's of course what we read last week, which is ironic or tragic, or again something we've seen many times. The Jews just saved the Chaldeans because remember, the Chaldeans are the ones who are part of the inner circle. And when Nebuchadnezzar said, you better tell me what my dream is, or I'll kill you, it was Daniel who said to them, I'll save you guys. And he does. He saves them by telling the dream. And the Chaldeans, at least in the inner court, they're saved by Daniel. And now these guys are bad mouthing Daniel's crew, at least, and are telling Nebuchadnezzar that they're not bowing down, which again sounds a lot like what we read about in Esther, right? About Mordecai not bowing down to Haman, which is from a later period, but similar kind of, or it takes place in a later period. This might have been written actually after the Mordecai and Esther and Haman story, but there seems to be a similar kind of thing here, which is that this is a empire-wide edict, which is also like Esther was, right? Everybody had to do it in the whole empire. And then also this idea that the Jews aren't following the rules and they're not bowing down. So it's it should be a little fresh in our minds because we just read the book of Esther. So here's what happened.
Then Nebuchadnezzar, in raging fury, ordered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be brought. So those men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke to them and said, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my God or worship the statue of gold that I have set up? Now, if you are ready to fall down and worship the statue that I have made, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, zither, lyre, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all other types of instruments, well and good. But if you will not worship, you shall at once be thrown into a burning fiery furnace. And what God is there that can save you from my power?"
Yeah. Yeah. I'm
It
going to give you a
sounds like a
sword.
Bond villain.
Yeah, it does. It like he just goes through the whole yeah that whole list of instruments every time. Uh, yeah, there seems to be a intentional
Maybe the
repetition.
author was being paid by the word.
Yeah, he's getting he's going to get that out there. Though again, of course, there might be some um, there might be some other translations of some of these. Like we don't know for sure it's a bagpipe, which is kind of cool. What does the King James say for the last instrument, Mary? Dulcimer? Yeah, well it's the one right before that. It's a dulcimer. Um, yeah, we're not sure. But what's interesting about it is that I've seen different translations for a bagpipe, but there seems to be a little clue that this was. I'm not gonna, like I said, I don't go into this a lot, and I'm only mentioning it because we kind of just looked at it. There's a little indication. So even though this is written in Aramaic, right? This is written in Aramaic. This whole line you just read was Aramaic. There is a little clue of when this was written because it's not written during the time of Daniel, of when Daniel would have lived during the Babylonian period. When again they could have been, yeah, they would have been speaking Aramaic, some form of Aramaic, Akkadian. That's what they spoke in the empire. And we'll get to that. We'll get to the language in a second. But look at this word right here. The word for bagpipe. Judith, I'll ask you to read that in Hebrew, well, Aramaic, but you can read the words. And you'll know right away that it's not a Hebrew or Aramaic word.
Sumponia
What does that sound like?
Symphony.
Yeah,
Greek.
which is not a Hebrew word, and it's not an Aramaic word, it's not a Semitic word. It is a
Greek.
yeah, that's a Greek word, man. That is the word for symphony, which it means did not, at least that word did not exist during the time of Nebuchadnezzar. So yeah, sometimes there's little clues that, this is a late book. And so somebody writing during the time of the Maccabees would have had no issue throwing in well, not throwing in, they didn't think about it. It's an anachronism. They used the word for symphonia, which was a Greek instrument similar. The reason why this translation says bagpipes is probably something more similar to a bagpipe that had a kind of that harmonious. I mean, I like bagpipes, but some people don't like them. But there's definitely lots of sounds going on in the bagpipe, and that's a Greek instrument that would have created sounds like an accordion or a bagpipe. So yeah, that is why they use that translation in our translation in front of us. Some type of instrument like that. So again, back to what's going on here, though, from the standpoint of what Nebuchadnezzar does, you're going to die if you don't go in. And of course, he sets him up with who's going to save you? What God is going to save you? Well, let's take you up. We're going to take you up on that offer, right? We're going to take you up on what God is there that can save you from my power. That is literally a setup, as you can imagine.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said in reply to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. For if so it must be, our God, whom we serve, is able to save us from the burning fiery furnace, and will save us from your power, O king.
Now, that's pretty audacious. That's a little bit of Jewish chutzpah, which is
Yeah.
okay. If you want to do it, we will be saved. Wow.
But even if our God does not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your God or worship the statue of gold that you have set up.
All right. Which is why this seems to be written by Maccabean type peoples who are like, we are not bowing down to this gold abomination of Zeus or whatever else that they put up in the temple. So this is, maybe again, a little bit of a clue that this is written during that time when Jews were like, are you kidding me? We're not going to worship your statue. Here we go.
Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his visage was distorted, and he gave an order to heat up the furnace to 7 times its usual heat. He commanded some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to throw them into the burning fiery furnace. So these men, in their shirts, trousers, hats, and other garments, were bound and thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace was heated to excess, a tongue of flame killed the men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
It got so hot that the people who carried the guys burned up. They were too hot. It was too hot to even get near it. So they burned up.
But those men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, dropped bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and rising in haste, addressed his companions, saying, "Did we not throw 3 men bound into the fire?" They spoke and replied, "Surely, O king."
Yeah. So Nebuchadnezzar can see this happening. So however the oven is set up, he can see these guys are in there in the fire. So this is one of those miracles that like people paid attention to. People reading the Bible, for thousands of years have been like, "Oh my gosh, this is crazy. This is a crazy miracle. This is God's power." Game of Thrones. Yeah, it's scary. It's definitely visual. And it's why you have that African American spiritual, which again we played and we can listen to it again, but it has more than just the fiery furnace story. But this story captivated people's minds. So, African slaves that were being held in America said, "Hey, if God can save people from a fiery furnace, he can definitely save us out of this jam." So it was inspirational for people. It really made people feel that way. And of course, Jews felt that if they could be saved in this way, then if that had happened, then God can do it again. So it was definitely an inspirational scene. It kind of is a reward, obviously, for being true to God and not bowing down to another God. But they seem to say, "Hey, look, if God doesn't save us, we're not going to do it anyways." So they basically say, "Yeah, God can save us. I don't know for sure God will, but it doesn't matter. We're not going in. We're not going to do it. Throw us in." So that's crazy. So that's already a miracle, but it's not over. Oh, sorry,
Nebuchadnezzar,
sorry.
sorry. He answered, "But I see 4 figures walking about, unbound and unharmed in the fire, and the fourth looks like a divine being."
Yeah. So it gets bigger. It's not just the 3 guys are now alive. They're walking around unbound in the furnace. So their chains or their stuff isn't on them anymore. Their binding gear is they're not bound anymore. And they're walking around with a fourth thing that doesn't look like a human being. Looks like an angel. The words that are used, the Hebrew words that are used, the Aramaic words that are used are what, Mary? Yeah, Bar Elohim. So that's Aramaic. How do you know it? Because in Hebrew it's Ben Elohim. But you know bar because you know the word bar mitzvah and you know the word bar kochba and you know the Aramaic word for son is used all the time. We use it so much that we almost use it interchangeably in Hebrew. Bar means son. And so Bar Elohim means the Son of God. Now, of course, later on, Christians will say this is Jesus with them in the fiery furnace. Jesus having not come into the world yet, but a Son of God is, and again, it's Elohim, which is the Aramaic version of Elohim. It means God. But that's why we translate it as divine being, because a Son of God in this case is the way that they would describe an angel. Now, remember, this is Nebuchadnezzar calling him Bar Elohim, right? It's not the Jews It's not those guys calling him a Bar Elohim. It's what Nebuchadnezzar described him as, which is a demigod or some kind of angel or some kind of divine being. So the translation's a good one, but that's not the actual literal words. So you can understand why people have interpreted it different ways, depending on your mentality, depending on what your agenda is. So the Son of God is the literal translation here. So, but again, it's what Nebuchadnezzar said. It's not what, it's his take on it. It's what Nebuchadnezzar's take it is. He's very impressed, though. There's no doubt. He's very impressed.
Nebuchadnezzar then approached the hatch of the burning fiery furnace and called, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the royal companions gathered around to look at those men, on whose bodies the fire had had no effect, the hair of whose heads had not been singed, whose shirts looked no different, to whom not even the odor of fire clung.
Yeah, and I've heard like, people try to explain this like somehow these guys coated themselves in some kind of fireproof retardant, fire retardant substance. Well, yeah, but it was on their hair, it was on their clothes. Nothing got burned, and they didn't even smell like they'd been in a fire. So, yes, it's not meant to be. There wasn't like some, magic ingredient that they had or scientific ingredient, which would have, of course, explained it. Yeah. So it doesn't, it's clearly not the intention, but for people who like to explain, there's people who they like explaining Bible miracles, right? They will say, well, all the miracles in Egypt can be explained, all the plagues can be explained by there was a volcanic eruption and it caused darkness and it caused this and it caused that and caused the locusts. And yeah, so people look for scientific explanations for how the Red Sea parted. Look, this is not meant to be explained by science. It's clearly they saw it as a miracle. I mean, it was a miracle. And Nebuchadnezzar's mind is blown.
Nebuchadnezzar spoke up and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in whom they placed their trust, and who sent an angel to save these servants who flouted the king's decree at the risk of their lives rather than serve or worship any god but their own God.
Yeah, and here the word that is used is a malka, an angel, a messenger. So that's their, yeah, that's the word that they use there. I think. One second. Yeah. Malacha. It's this one, Malcha. That's Malcha is the king. Malacha is the angel. They're both here. Both words are here. But yeah, I'm just looking. Is there any other words in the Aramaic? Nope. But anyways, it's a good translation. Anyways, all right. So here's what Nebuchadnezzar says.
I hereby give an order that anyone of any people or nation of whatever language who blasphemes the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their house confiscated, for there is no other God who is able to save in this way.
Yeah, so this is like a full on, almost like a religious conversion that Nebuchadnezzar has, right? He's like, oh my gosh, this is a real God. This is real, right? There's no other God who can do this. So what turned into what was supposed to be an affirmation of his gods turns into an affirmation of Adonai. Your thing just kind of backfired. You wanted everyone to worship your God, and now you're worshiping God. And he says, look, everybody else, whoever badmouths these guys or badmouths their God, they're going to be torn limb from limb. Oh, God, the one and only God. Yeah.
Thereupon the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, to all people and nations of every language that inhabit the whole earth, may your well-being abound. The signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me, I am pleased to relate. How great are God's signs, how mighty God's wonders. God's kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and God's dominion endures throughout the generations.
Wow. So that is uh, quite a statement from, from a pagan king that he has now seen God's power. Now, we'll say that um, well, we'll show you that there is a extra part as I mentioned, that is in the translation. I'll just share with you real quick. This is the extra additions to, this is from the Catholic Bible, from the New American Bible. This is from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. This is like their official. So they had, after they're thrown in, this prayer of Azari, which starts for after chapter after verse 23, verse 24 is not in the Hebrew Bible. And so for the next section here is the prayer, which is that Azariah, as he's again, Abednego, as he's in the fire, he says, "Blessed are you, praiseworthy, O Lord, the God of our ancestors, and glorious forever is your name." And then there's a prayer, which is called, again, the prayer of Azariah. So this addition is not like at the end of the book of Daniel, it's in the middle of Daniel or towards the beginning of Daniel, is this whole section here, which is all part of this prophecy, part of this addition. So this is a prayer, and it's a beautiful prayer. Nothing like, that unusual. Just a nice prayer. And then it ends with the last part of it is Nebuchadnezzar's reaction to this, and then it ends the same way. And that is the way that this addition, that's the way the addition kind of comes through them in the last part of chapter 3. So chapter 3 in the Catholic Bible is 100 verses, right? Instead of 33 verses, there's 66 verses added to it, which is this prayer. So it's interesting that there's like this extra prayer. Who added it? Who gave them the authority? John asked. Well, they felt that it existed in the Septuagint, in the Greek version, and they felt therefore that there was a tradition that included it, and they didn't seem to care that it wasn't in the Hebrew Bible. As I mentioned, Martin Luther did. And the Jews didn't keep it, and this is their book. So let's not add things to it. Look, some people think that Martin Luther did that because Martin Luther thought that if he kind of made his new group a little bit closer to the original faith, if you will, that Jews would be attracted to it. I don't think he was he wasn't successful in that, and eventually he kind of really he became really angry about that when Jews did not come to the Protestant faith. He didn't call it the Protestant faith, but when they didn't come to his teachings, he became fairly anti-Semitic. He was disappointed, let's put it that way. But he did seem to have a period. We kind of believe that when he was really moving away from the Catholic Church, that he did stuff to differentiate it. And one of the things he did was say, we're not putting those books in that are not part of the Hebrew Bible. We're going to respect the Jewish tradition in that way of saying, look, they knew what should be in it. And so that's why, again, it's not in the King James. And to some extent, as I mentioned to you, the King James Bible, which is, again, wasn't Martin Luther who commissioned it, it was English Protestants who commissioned it. They really wanted to go back to the Hebrew text as much as possible. So the King James, I think, is a great translation because they tried to get the Hebrew, they tried to capture the Hebrew elements very seriously. So they brought in Jews to help translate it. They brought in Jews to say, okay, we're not going to just rely on the Septuagint. We're not going to just rely on the Latin Vulgate, the Latin version of the Bible. We're going to go back to what does the Masoretic text say? What does the Hebrew Bible say? And so the King James, and I think that's been it's been a kind of a tradition within the Protestant community for a long time, which is like, we don't care what the Catholic Church did. So, John, your question is in an interesting one from the standpoint of, yeah, for a long time, people said, well, the Catholic Church did it, and we have to respect that. And then, kind of, when the Protestants came along and said, they literally said the Catholics were wrong. You didn't have the authority to add these. We're taking them out. So that's why, again, people who were raised in a Protestant community, Protestant ministers, they don't know from this. Again, it's not like we sit around, like clergy sits around and says, hey, by the way, you don't know the additions to Daniel. Most people don't read Daniel anyways, especially within the Jewish community. It's not like the rabbi sat around and read Daniel. More Kabbalistic or more mystical people did, but not from the standpoint of law. I mean, this is a tough book to derive halakha from. I mean, what's the halakha here? If you get thrown into if you get a choice between bowing down to a god or or thrown into the fire, get thrown into the fire. Do what they did. But that's about the only law you can get from it. And even that's not even clear. Even there, some of the rabbis say, you know what? It's better pretend. When somebody tells you need to bow down to a god, bow down and tie your shoelace so that they think you're bowing down. You don't really have to bow down. I got to tie my shoelace. That was a way to get out of stuff. I'm not kidding. They came up with, there were other rabbis in the time who said, no, you don't bow down. You don't pretend that you're bowing down. You don't tie your shoelace. You get martyred. Differences of opinion, though. There were differences of opinion on whether you had to do it for idol worship. Some people said, also depending on your position. If you were the rabbi of the community and somebody said you got to bow down, you had no choice. You had to martyr yourself. But if you were a random dude who was just told by some random guy, hey, it's time for you to bow down, and you pretend like you're tying tie your shoelace, pretend like you're bowing, and live to see another day. So there are different teachings about martyrdom. Anyways, let's look at chapter 4 and back to still Nebuchadnezzar and still Daniel. This one's actually, that story really didn't have that much to do with Daniel. It had to do with his friends. But let's take a look at chapter 4.
I, Nebuchadnezzar, was living serenely in my house, flourishing in my palace. I had a dream that frightened me, and my thoughts in bed and the vision of my mind alarmed me.
What the heck just happened? This just became a first person narrative story from King Nebuchadnezzar? Yes, that's what just happened. I, Nebuchadnezzar, Ana Nebuchadnezzar, I'm Nebuchadnezzar. That's the way this starts, right? And he's having bad dreams, which we knew he had a bad dream in chapter 2. Here we go.
I gave an order to bring all the sages of Babylon before me to let me know the meaning of the dream. The magicians, exorcists, Chaldeans, and diviners came, and I related the dream to them, but they could not make its meaning known to me. Finally, Daniel, called Belteshazzar after the name of my God, in whom the spirit of the holy gods was, came to me, and I related the dream to him, saying, Belteshazzar, chief magician, in whom I know the spirit of the holy gods to be, and whom no mystery baffles, tell me the meaning of my dream vision that I have seen. In the visions of my mind in bed, I saw a tree of great height in the midst of the earth. The tree grew and became mighty. Its top reached heaven, and it was visible to the ends of the earth. Its foliage was beautiful, and its fruit abundant. There was food for all in it. Beneath it, the beasts of the field found shade, and the birds of the sky dwelt on its branches. All creatures fed on it. In the vision of my mind in bed, I looked and saw a holy watcher coming down from heaven, who called loudly and said, hew down the tree, lop off its branches, Strip off its foliage, scatter its fruit. Let the beasts of the field flee from beneath it, and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump with its roots in the ground, in fetters of iron and bronze, in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and share the earth's verdure with the beasts. Let his mind be altered from that of a human, and let him be given the mind of a beast, and let 7 seasons pass over him. This sentence is decreed by the watchers. This verdict is commanded by the holy ones, so that all creatures may know that the Most High is sovereign over human dominion and gives it out at will, perhaps setting over it even the lowest of human beings.
Yeah, we'll explain it in a second.
King Nebuchadnezzar, had this dream. Now you, Belteshazzar, tell me its meaning, since all the sages of my kingdom are not able to make its meaning known to me. But you are able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you.
Yeah. And so here, Nebuchadnezzar definitely feels that Daniel has the power to interpret this dream. And he doesn't recognize, like, he still says maybe your God is great, but there are other gods, and you definitely have the spirit of gods in you. By the way, it doesn't seem like it's that hard of a dream to interpret, but whatever. The other people can't interpret it. Maybe they don't want to interpret it because the interpretation seems to be pretty straightforward, Nebuchadnezzar. But look at what Daniel does. And of course, they keep, Nebuchadnezzar reminds us that, hey, I renamed that guy. I renamed him, and he's now Belteshazzar. And Scott Volz just walked in, by the way, just so everybody knows that everyone can go crazy because Scott is returned. Now, he's not returning. I wish he was, but he's still in Vegas, but he's with us today to read part of Daniel. So welcome, Scott. Um, this is again very much like Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. But now we've got how does he tell Nebuchadnezzar what appears to be you're in for some bad times, king.
Then Daniel, called Belteshazzar, was perplexed for a while and alarmed by his thoughts. The king addressed him, "Let the dream and its meaning not alarm you." Belteshazzar replied, "My lord, would that the dream were for your enemy and its meaning for your foe. The tree that you saw grow and become mighty, whose top reached heaven, which was visible throughout the earth, whose foliage was beautiful, whose fruit was so abundant that there was food for all in it, beneath which the beasts of the field dwelt, and in whose branches the birds of the sky lodged. It is you, O king, you who have grown and become mighty, whose greatness has grown to reach heaven, and whose dominion is to the end of the earth."
Yeah, well, that's the good part of it, right? The good part of it is, hey, uh,
Well,
King
we can see
Nebuchadnezzar,
why
you're like a huge tree, and everything is underneath your dominion, and you've grown really big and powerful, and your kingdom is everywhere. That's the good part of it. It's a good way to start, which is buttering him up and making him feel better because he's about to drop a bomb on him.
right.
But
You can see why the other interpreters didn't want to touch it with a
don't
10-foot pole.
don't really want to tell it. And again, it seems pretty straightforward. And Nebuchadnezzar does tell him right off the bat,
Yeah,
right? Let the dream and its meaning not alarm you,
right.
right? So he's telling him, just tell me what it is. Don't worry about it. And of course, maybe Nebuchadnezzar also knew that this is not good because if I'm the tree,
Mhm.
and I'm gonna be cut down. Now, um, so that the first part is good. The first part is uh, you're everywhere. Your power is everywhere. Now it gets the bad part.
The holy watcher, whom the king saw descend from heaven, and say, hew down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump with its roots in the ground and fetters of iron and bronze in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven and share the lot of the beasts of the field until 7 seasons pass over him. This is its meaning, O king. It is the decree of the Most High that has overtaken my lord the king. You will be driven away from society and have your habitation with the beasts of the field. You will be fed grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 seasons will pass over you until you come to know that the Most High is sovereign over human dominion and gives it out at will. And the meaning of the command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots is that the kingdom will remain yours from the time you come to know that heaven is sovereign. Therefore, O king, may my advice be acceptable to you. Redeem your sins by beneficence and your iniquities by generosity to the poor. Then your serenity may be extended.
Yeah. So he tells them what's going to happen, right? You have to spend 7 seasons, which is like 2 years, the better part of 2 years, as living like a wild animal. You're going to become like a wild animal. You're going to lose, like you're going to lose your mind. Your situation is going to be one of, yeah, you're going to be rolling around like an animal. Um, But the good news is that it's a limited time, and you'll get to come back and you'll be able to be king again. And you might be able to make it a little softer by doing some mitzvahs, right? You can help your situation out by being generous, helping out the poor. And maybe it'll be better for you. So it's a really tough thing that you just had to tell the most powerful king in the world that you're going to go nuts. But again, it's a limited time, and you're being punished because to some extent you haven't recognized God. Now he did a little bit in the last chapter after he saw him in the fiery furnace, his friends in the fiery furnace. He saw what God's miracles were. He recognized that there was something really special with God. Look, there's a real problem with Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible, and it's one that has tremendous ramifications for evil in Jewish thought, and specifically people who are able to exercise power over us, including, again, all the way through to the modern period into like Hitler, for example, is how do people who are able to gather power, how are they able to wield it against us and get away with it? Part of it is that these people, in some cases, Nebuchadnezzar being one of them, Pharaoh being another, you know, any of the Persian monarchs that we're going to eventually encounter, is that God gives them the power to do that. So God allows them to wreak vengeance on us. And Nebuchadnezzar, of all the people in the Bible, is the most obvious in his ability and his strength that it must be given by God. God must have chosen Nebuchadnezzar for this, but because of what he does and because he still destroys Jerusalem and he still is responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of Jews, he can't get away scot-free. And so even if he's an agent of God to some extent, he must be punished. And so this punishment is part of it. The other punishment that we'll see is that his kingdom doesn't last long. Within a generation, his kingdom's already falling apart after he's gone, and the Persians take over. And so if you will, there's also that. And we mentioned that there's even this tradition that Nebuchadnezzar's daughter is Vashti, and she was in the Persian court as kind of serving as Ahasuerus's wife because, she was connected to the previous royal dynasty once the Persians took over. Again, it's a midrash. It's not based on like the continuity of or the chronology of what actually happens, but the rabbis imagine that Nebuchadnezzar and his family are still getting punished to some extent. And there's even midrashim that Nebuchadnezzar is still being punished because of what he did was not even though it was he was doing God's will to some extent, it wasn't right. And what he did he still needs to be punished for it. But there's this weird kind of like, yeah, but he must have had he must have been given God's authority. And then you have the fact that Daniel basically says that this is all part of God's plan and that Nebuchadnezzar gets to come back. And so it's a really weird, he's more than, it's more than just one guy. It's this whole question of what happens when somebody is able to have power over us, and this kind of like, but he got away with it. So what do we, what do we make of this? How did this evil get created? And look, there's versions of that even when I say the modern era, like every enemy that the Jewish people have ever had, there's some kind of mythology to them, which is like, did we create this problem, or are we responsible for this problem? Or again, are we being punished through this guy for something we did? And is there like a lesson from that? Is there a bigger lesson? And I would say, like, the most recent version of that is Sinwar, because Sinwar was in an Israeli prison and learned about Israel and was, according to the doctors and the psychiatrists and the people who worked with him, was much smarter than most of the other prisoners in the that were being, the terrorists that were being held by Israel. And of course, he was exchanged for Gilad Shalit, which again, all of these things go into the kind of the mythology of how the seeds of our destruction are planted in some cases by us. And did we saved his life? I mean, he was operated on in an Israeli hospital when he was being held, and did we help this, even unintentionally, in helping this enemy of the Jewish people in our own day? So there's always these questions of like, is there a bigger lesson that we can learn out of this? And Nebuchadnezzar is like the first. I mean, I remember I did a paper about him in rabbinical school, because like the more I read about it, I went down this rabbit hole of like Nebuchadnezzar is like everywhere in the Midrash. And there's even like legends that Pharaoh is like this undying enemy of the Jews in a way, and he becomes Nebuchadnezzar. Like Pharaoh was Nebuchadnezzar. Like the Pharaoh of Egypt is still alive and is like now taken the identity of Nebuchadnezzar. He's now the king of Babylonia. So like this almost like this evil enemy that like you almost have to, you deal with forever, because you can't destroy it, and you're always to some extent creating it. But the fact that he has to go through this he reverts to this animal state seems to be part again of this mythology. But let's look at what happens.
All this befell King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later, as he was walking on the roof of the royal palace at Babylon. The king exclaimed, "There is great Babylon, which I have built by my vast power to be a royal residence for the glory of my majesty." The words were still on the king's lips when a voice fell from heaven. "It has been decreed for you, O King Nebuchadnezzar. The kingdom has passed out of your hands. You are being driven away from society, and your habitation is to be with the beasts of the field. You are to be fed grass like cattle, and 7 seasons will pass over you until you come to know that the Most High is sovereign over human dominion and gives it out at will." There and then the sentence was carried out upon Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven away from society. He ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like eagle's feathers and his nails like the talons of birds.
Yeah, so he becomes not just like cattle, he becomes like a bird. He becomes like, he looks like, this kind of animalistic kind of situation. And Rosemary can probably guess what picture I'm going to show right now. This is one of the greatest biblical pictures I've ever seen is this one, which is from about, believe it or not, it's from about 300 years ago, or no, 200 and something, 220 years ago. This is the illustration that the artist William Blake did of Nebuchadnezzar as a wild beast. I mean, this was done about 1800. So it's quite a picture. I mean, it almost looks like something you'd see from the modern era. But you can see his talons as you know, his hair. So this is a very famous picture that Blake did, and kind of captured the power of what happens to him. This almost becomes like a werewolf that Nebuchadnezzar went through this becoming an animal. So remember, this is all kind of being told from Nebuchadnezzar's first person vantage point.
When the time had passed, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason was restored to me. I blessed the Most High, and praised and glorified the ever living one, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and whose kingdom endures throughout the generations. All the inhabitants of the earth are of no account. God deals at will with the host of heaven and with the inhabitants of the earth. There is none to say, God, stay God's hand, or to ask, what have you done? There and then my reason was restored to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom. My companions and nobles sought me out, and I was re-established over my kingdom, and added greatness was given me. So now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and glorify the ruler of heaven, all of whose works are just, and whose ways are right, and who is able to humble those who behave arrogantly.
Yeah. So again, when Nebuchadnezzar was feeling his most arrogant, that's when he got humbled. We have no evidence, and we know Nebuchadnezzar from his writings and from people who lived around his time, that this we don't have a record of him going nuts for 2 years and becoming an animal. That would have been written down. But the idea that we had that this happened and that Nebuchadnezzar has kind of like a religious conversion here, and even he recognizes God, is an interesting idea. And it's one that can kind of like maybe was a hope that Jews had, that like even the most powerful people of the world could acknowledge that. That's why we have, and we read it on the Wednesday night classes recently, the stories in the Talmud of Judah Hanasi talking with Marcus Aurelius, and to call him Antoninus in the Talmud, that he has these discussions with Judah Hanasi, where basically the Roman emperor is acknowledging God as the real God, but he can't say anything because he's the emperor of Rome. So there's like a basis for this that starts here in Daniel, of people who finally recognize God. But look, I mean, there's a little bit of that in Pharaoh, right? When Pharaoh finally has to say, I give up. I can't, I mean, there is only God. I mean, he doesn't say it like Nebuchadnezzar does, but the pagan emperor, the king, the most powerful man in the world, crying uncle in front of God, saying, you're God. So this idea that eventually our enemies would kind of give up and recognize this was part of our belief, was that they would eventually do that. Look, it became more difficult once people are kind of following monotheistic traditions to say, hey, don't they already recognize God? But clearly that's not the way they're behaving. It's not the way they're treating the Jews. They're not treating God's people very well. So it didn't seem like they understood that they were serving the one God. But it always was a little bit more difficult under Christians and Muslims for people to say, well, they say they're worshiping God. And so that it became a little bit more complex, a little bit more problematic. But there is that feeling like, well, they do. I mean, like there are some people it was obvious, like with Stalin, rejecting religion, rejecting God completely. That was an easy call to say, oh, this person doesn't really recognize God. But did a did a did a person who was king, who was supposedly, had a Bible, had access to the Bible, did they not understand? But this becomes kind of a theme for us as Jews, which is, will people recognize God? And that's why in our prayers, like the Alenu, we say God will be one. God's name will be one. That people will recognize God and they'll say there's one God, and that they will, you know, to some extent, that'll be a recognition that we were right and that people are worshiping the God that we've been screaming about for 3,000 years. So this is again, it's not part of our liturgy, as we said. This is not, Daniel doesn't make it into the liturgy, but the theme definitely does. It definitely is part of our understanding. So that's the way chapter 4 ends, with Nebuchadnezzar becoming an animal, and then becoming not an animal anymore and taking over and recognizing God. But what happens to Daniel as things progress is an interesting question, because chapter 5, which we'll now reads,
King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for his 1,000 nobles, and in the presence of the 1,000 he drank wine.
what happened to Nebuchadnezzar? So there's something that happened between chapters 4 and 5, which is that Nebuchadnezzar is no longer king. He's no longer there, which would mean that he's no longer alive. Because in those days, that's the way you stop being king. So, yes, Nebuchadnezzar, his reign comes to an end, and then his dynasty soon comes to an end. But let's just take a look really quickly at this dynasty, because I'll just show you a very quick list of these kings. Nebuchadnezzar is right here. He's actually, of course, not the first person called Nebuchadnezzar. His grandfather was Nebuchadnezzar the first, which again, the word Nebuchadnezzar means Nabu, the god. He has the god Nabu in his name, is guaranteeing my heir. Well, his father, Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, is the emperor, is the king, and then Nebuchadnezzar is the king. And you can see he finishes in 562, which is not long after the temple is destroyed. It's about 6 years after the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. And then you can see what happens after he dies. He has a wife, and you can see he has a son. But the son, Amel Marduk or Evel Marduk, is king for a very short period of time, 2 years. And then he has a daughter, Nebuchadnezzar, who might be called Nitocris. She marries a guy named Nabonidus, and they have a son named Belshazzar. Now, this is it. And what seems to be kind of the issue is that there's chaos after Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And this guy Belshazzar, who is a guy, and again, through his mother, he may have been a grandson. We don't even know, right? There doesn't seem to be very legitimate claims on that. That's what basically they're saying, is we don't really think that Belshazzar was related to Nebuchadnezzar, but this guy was king for a very short period of time, and he's in this scene we're about to read. As you can see, the commentary here, this is sometimes, again, described as historical fiction, because it's not written during his lifetime. It's not written anywhere near his lifetime. If this is written when we think it is, it's written hundreds of years later. But we don't really know much about this guy other than he kind of oversees the last days of the Babylonian dynasty before the Persians take over. And that's what's in this scene. So Belshazzar, like the name Belshazzar, Daniel's name, has the name Bel and Shazzar, the coming from the, again, Bel, the other main god in the Babylonian pantheon. These guys have those names, right? Bel, Nabu, Marduk, which, by the way, is the root of the name Mordechai. These are gods in the Babylonian pantheon. These are Babylonian gods who fight for power and kind of behave a little bit like the Olympian gods. But yeah, so King Belshazzar has pretty much the same name as Daniel does, Babylonian god name. Again, we call him Daniel, but they called him Belshazzar. But this is the king Belshazzar. So here's what happens with a new king. Again, not introduced as a new king. We're not told what happens to Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, which again seems to be important from the standpoint of, like, the people who wrote Daniel didn't care. They're not telling you the court history of the Babylonians. They're telling you what Daniel did amongst the court. But it's not like they didn't think it's important. It's not like they didn't. Look, that last chapter was all told from the first person standpoint of Nebuchadnezzar. The whole story is put in Nebuchadnezzar's voice, right? I mean, look, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise. I mean, it's important, but it's not important what really happened to these people. And that's why people will say it's a historical fiction. It's just not, whatever it is, it's not important to the author. It's not important to us, really. It's now what happens in this scene. So the last scene, it's a dream interpretation. It's Nebuchadnezzar being punished, which is a divine punishment. I mean, it is God, not nearly as impressive as being thrown into the fire, but it is a transformation, and it's not a little thing that happens when the king goes into a descent into regressing to an animal. But let's look what happens in this scene, which also has a miracle. Some would say not the most impressive miracle, but it's still a miracle, and it's still something that, again, is part of this first part of Daniel, which are these court miracles, these things that happen. And we're going to get to this one and one more today. So let's read.
This scroll, please.
Yeah.
Oh, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for his 1,000 nobles, and in the presence of the 1,000 he drank wine. Under the influence of the wine, Belshazzar ordered the gold and silver vessels that his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple at Jerusalem to be brought, so that the king and his nobles, his consorts, and his concubines could drink from them.
Yeah. And again, the fact that he's not really Nebuchadnezzar's son, it doesn't matter. Maybe his grandson, maybe not related at all. It's not important. So people will get hung up on, well, he's not really his son. Okay, well, that's not the point. He is inherited the throne from this dynasty. And much more important is he's taking out the stuff that was stolen from the temple, was taken from the temple by Nebuchadnezzar. And so that's the important thing. He's getting drunk and he's bringing out these things, which, by the way, as we mentioned it when we read Esther a couple of weeks ago, according to tradition, according to the rabbis, the Persians inherited this stuff from them. And so when King Ahasuerus is having a party, he's still using those same vessels. Doesn't say it, but the rabbis interpret it because the vessels seem to be an important story there. And it's a continued violation of using our stuff for parties, for partying. You're using God's stuff. Not good.
The golden vessels that had been taken out of the sanctuary of the house of God in Jerusalem were then brought, and the king, his nobles, his consorts, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Just that. The fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand, so that the king could see the hand as it wrote. The king's face darkened, and his thoughts alarmed him. The joints of his loins were loosened, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly for the exorcists, Chaldeans, and diviners to be brought. The king addressed the sages of Babylon. Whoever can read this writing and tell me its meaning shall be clothed in purple and wear a golden chain on his neck, and shall rule as one of three in the kingdom.
Well, you can probably guess what's going to happen with that little challenge, right? Tell me who can read this writing. And by the way, it's not just that there was writing that appeared, it says that there was a hand that appeared to write it on the wall. So it's not just there's writing on a wall. No, there's a hand that floats and you know in the air writing this. It's pretty impressive. It's scary and needs to be understood. So he brings out the same kinds of crew that Nebuchadnezzar did. Exorcists, or again, the word is asaphia, you know, the necromancers, if you will, but also again, Chaldeans and diviners, you know, people who have these, and sometimes it will say magicians, these people who can do these things, they can interpret these miracles. So they came.
Then all the king's sages came, but they could not read the writing or make known its meaning to the king. King Belshazzar grew exceedingly alarmed, and his face darkened, and his nobles were dismayed. Because of the state of the king and his nobles, the queen came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke up and said, "O king, live forever. Let your thoughts not alarm you, or your face darken. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In your father's time, illumination, understanding, and wisdom like that of the gods were to be found in him. And your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, exorcists, Chaldeans, and diviners. Seeing that there is to be found in Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, to explain riddles, and solve problems, let Daniel now be called to tell the meaning of the writing."
Yeah. And this is an interesting scene for a lot of reasons. That, first of all, it's the queen who comes up with the idea, let's go to Daniel, right? So this is pretty interesting. A woman, of course, now saving the day, which sounds a little bit like Esther in a way of like, you know, telling what really should happen. I'm going to fix this for you. What had happened to Daniel? They forgot about him, it seems, right? there's this guy that we have. He doesn't seem to know about him. He doesn't think about it. The wife has to come and tell him, you know, there's this guy Daniel, which means that like maybe in the next kingdom he's locked out. He's not part of the new crew that came in. So there's this guy that you can go to for help. Your dad went to him. Again, there seems to be a lack of knowledge, but that happens, right? A new administration comes in and everyone else got locked out. Those people are not part of the inner circle anymore. And the fact that you know, if it had been a couple of generations, then it would be even more, you know, believable that again, he's just not, people have forgotten about him. So let's bring him out of the mothballs. Let's get him out here and bring him out to help us. So we have a guy, and he was successful before. Maybe he can help us now.
Daniel was then brought before the king. The king addressed Daniel. "You are Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom my father, the king, brought from Judah. I have heard about you, that you have the spirit of the gods in you, and that illumination, knowledge, and extraordinary wisdom are to be found in you. Now, the sages and exorcists have been brought before me to read this writing and to make known its meaning to me, but they could not tell what it meant."
And by the way, I mentioned last week, I'm not loving the Exorcist translation only because, like, okay, it's possible that that was one of the jobs that the people have, but it's not like, when we think about Exorcist, we're thinking, I told you, Linda Blair and just demons. As I said, that's not the King James translation. The King James has what, Mary? Yeah, astrologers. Yeah, which makes sense from the standpoint of the Babylonians were very into astrology. So, yeah, but doesn't matter. Whatever their knowledge was, it wasn't good enough. They can't decode this. They can't decipher this message.
I have heard about you, that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known its meaning to me, you shall be clothed in purple and wear a golden chain on your neck and rule as one of three in the kingdom. Then Daniel said in reply to the king, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your presents to others, but I will read the writing for the king and make its meaning known to him. O King, the Most High God bestowed kingship, grandeur, glory, and majesty upon your father Nebuchadnezzar.
By the way, this is the point, right? That I was talking about. God made Nebuchadnezzar. God gave him that power, which means this is all God's plan. Even the bad guy who destroyed the temple had to have done it with God's plan. God gave him this power. So, again, the Most High God, that's the one who gave your dad this kingdom and this power.
And because of the grandeur that God bestowed upon him, all the peoples and nations of every language trembled in fear of him. He put to death whom he wished, and whom he wished he let live. He raised high whom he wished, and whom he wished he brought low. But when he grew haughty and willfully presumptuous, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was removed from him. He was driven away from society, and his mind made like that of a beast, and his habitation was with wild asses. He was fed grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he came to know that the Most High God is sovereign over human dominion and sets rulers over it at will. But you, Belshazzar, his son, did not humble yourself, although you knew all this.
So what we read about the last chapter, yeah, Belshazzar, you should know what happened to, your father or grandfather. You should know that he was taught this lesson. You didn't you didn't humble yourself. You didn't learn. You didn't learn.
You exalted yourself against the sovereign of heaven, whose temple vessels you had brought to you. You and your nobles, your consorts, and your concubines drank wine from them and praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But the God who controls your life breath and every move you make, this one you did not glorify.
Yeah. And so this is part of the problem. Not only did you not recognize God, you're recognizing these other gods that are powerless. They're made out of nothing. And of course, you took God's stuff. You took the vessels from the temple and you've been passing them around to your family and also to your consorts. There's just random ladies that are standing here too, drinking out of these cups. This is not respectful. This is not respectful to God. Yeah, and you're not respecting God. So your dad learned this lesson. Now you have to learn this lesson.
He therefore made the hand appear and caused the writing to be inscribed. This is the writing that is inscribed. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And its meaning, and this is its meaning, mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians.
Yep. So the words essentially mean, you know, numbered, weighed Persians. Time's up, and the Persians are going to take over now. So the the writer of this is not super familiar with the history. He didn't know that, or they didn't know that that there was a guy in between Belshazzar and, or a couple of guys in between Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar. That's not the bigger historical inaccuracy that's about to come up, but it doesn't matter, right? It's not, this is not a history lesson, but there doesn't seem to be, again, a real big concern other than what does happen. The Persians take over after this. This guy is the last king of the Chaldeans, of the Babylonians, because the Persians are going to come. And according to this, God told them that. God not only, this was part of God's plan. So Ahasuerus's family, the Achaemenid dynasty that takes over, the Persians who conquer the Babylonians, this is God's plan. And to some extent, like I said, it's punishment for the fact that the Babylonians did destroy the temple. So it's this weird, like, paradox, which is they did God's work, but they also destroyed the temple. So the agent of God's destruction must be punished. And so his kingdom must come to an end, even if he recognizes he's God's agent. So it's a really weird position that someone would put themselves in, which is, do you want, if you want this power and you're going to exercise this power, the consequences are going to be that you're eventually going to get punished. I don't know. You got to wonder. You got to wonder if the enemies of the Jewish people throughout history, like, don't they read this? Don't they know? Maybe they don't care. Maybe they want to be part of the story. I don't know. You just don't know. I mean, you just don't know. Did the Nazis not? I mean, they knew this. Some say they knew it. Like, are people willing to be part of the story of the Jewish people, even if they're going to be the bad guys in the story? I don't know. It's weird. Like, I don't know. But this is it. This is your empire is over. And Daniel says to them, look, you can keep your stuff. You can keep it. I'm going to tell you what's on the wall. Then he's probably again saying, to some extent, you're not going to like what I'm telling you. It's over. The Persians are coming. So here's what they do.
Then at Belshazzar's command, they clothed Daniel in purple, placed a golden chain on his neck, and proclaimed that he should rule as one of three in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed.
Yeah. Well, he did get killed. There is that. But like the last couple of years I showed you, there were like 3 kings of Babylonia. None of them lasted for more than a couple of years. It was just chaos. And it was because the Persians were already there. It's not like the Persians just came out of nowhere. They were already making problems. They were already encroaching on the Babylonian. They were breathing down their necks, if you will. And so, Daniel tells them, and he's not punished for it. Not only is he not punished for it, he's made even more powerful. He's made one of the top three in the country. So that's what happens to him. Belshazzar doesn't punish him. And then he gets killed. He gets assassinated. And Belshazzar Daniel's in power now. Belshazzar's dead and Daniel's now in power. But now what? The Babylonians aren't in charge anymore. Well, guess what? There's even a comma there because maybe we don't even break because it says right here.
And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old.
And here's the interesting piece of information here. The reason why we know that this book does not, I'm not going to call it historical fiction. There's no sense in like, what's the genre of historical fiction? This is the issue. As much as like, I'm going to argue over whether Nebuchadnezzar was his father or grandfather, the bigger problem is this dude, Darius the Mede, doesn't exist. This is just this guy. People have tried to figure out what are they talking about here? Which person are they talking about? There was a King Darius. He didn't live now. He's not, this is not his time. This is not a dude that we know of from history. It's a mistake, if you will. I mean, there is a Median, there's a takeover, right? There's a takeover during this time of the Persian takeover, right? Persians, as I told you, took over this dynasty. They took over the kingdom and made their own Persian kingdom, right? But here's that this is a guy that he's the guy who took over. You know, he's a guy. He's a guy. Yeah, I mean, they just who cares? I mean, it's like you don't know. It's like but they didn't care. They're not. First of all, they don't care, right? They're like, you know, who's going to argue with it, right? Who's the guy who's going to argue with us over this? Because here, I'll just show you real quick. Um, since we're here and we can do this. Um, um, Here you go. This is the dynasty right here. So the dynasty is started by this line, right? These are Persian kings that are kings, but they don't control the empire. This dude right here, Cyrus II, is the one who destroys the Babylonian Empire. He's the one who takes over, right? There's Cyrus right here. He's not even the first Cyrus. There's a grandfather of his that was not as powerful as him. So Cyrus is the king, and then he has a son, and one of his sons becomes king for a little bit, and then one of his kings becomes king for like a little bit because he's assassinated. There's all these assassinations, and then this dude Darius takes over. Now here's Darius, and then there's of course another Darius, and then there's another Darius. This Darius is the one who's really famous because he battled Alexander the Great. But these early Dariuses, this Darius who they seem to be talking about, or he's the first Darius we know of, he's not actually even from this family. He maybe married into the family. Even that we're not really certain, but that's why it says lineage claimed by Darius the First. There was a king, there was an emperor Darius who was the ruler of this great empire, but he lived about 20, 30 years later. He took over 30 years after Cyrus. They're close and they don't care. It's not their issue, but it's also not, again, Darius is a really important emperor. He starts his family, you know, he has Xerxes, right, who's, you know, ancestors of Xerxes, this is Ahasuerus, right? All these guys in green are kings of the Achaemenid dynasty, the Persian dynasty, which goes, as you can see, from 550 to about 330. That's 200 years. For about 200 years, this family, or the people who attach themselves to this family, because you have Koresh and then you have Darius and then you have, these other guys, right? Xerxes guys. These guys are good to the Jews. They're the ones who let the Jews go home. We like these guys. This is back when the Persians were our friends. This is the one who's maybe married to Esther. Yeah. Yeah. The Persians came from right next door, right next door. So just east of Babylonia is where Persians were. Now, once they conquer Babylonia, they make Babylon one of their capitals. But their other capital, Susa, is further to the south in modern day Iran. So these are the ancestors of the Iranian people. And of course, when the Shah was in power, these guys, like Koresh and Darius and Xerxes, they loved these people. They loved them. They used them as all the time as examples of Persian greatness. It's one of the reasons why Muslims who took over don't want to talk about these guys, because they were pagan, they were Zoroastrian, they were not Muslim. And so they don't like to talk about that. They don't want to talk about the great Persian history, even though they do, because they want to say the Persians are mighty people and were powerful and whatever, but they don't invoke these people. The Shah and his family 100% invoked these Persian greats. They were Muslim, but they weren't so Muslim. They were Muslim, but they were not so Muslim. They loved to drink. They loved to party. They had lots of fun. And they used this imagery from the Achaemenid dynasty all the time. They used those pictures, those reliefs, those drawings of Persian greatness, and they loved it. And they invoked these guys like Darius and Cyrus and Xerxes all the time. So, yeah, this is the. Oh, and by the way, let's just show you real quick what we mean by that. If you look at the if you look at the flag of Iran today, right? If you look at the flag of Iran today, where's the Iranian flag? The flag, oh, that's not the flag. Let me just show you. Well, you've seen it. You've seen it recently. It's been in the news a lot. Let me show you. Let me show you again. And as I mentioned, there are some Iranians who don't even like to be called Iranian. They like to be called Persian. But let me just see if I can find. Yeah, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Iran, but it is relevant, and I'm trying to find. Yeah, I'm trying to find the. Let me just show you the flag of Iran today, which is this flag. This is the flag of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This was not the flag of Iran when the Shah was in power. I'll show you that flag. This was a flag that. Let me just show you the other flag. This was the flag of Iran before. And by this was the Shah's flag. That flag was considered way too pagan, way too idolatrous for the Muslims. So they decided to go back to this kind of flag, a more Muslim flag with a symbol rather than with an animal. So, yeah, this is an issue for people in Iran today. How Persian are they going to be? How much are they going to embrace this? So let's read. We'll finish with chapter 6 today. The changeover from Babylonians to Persians. And what did that mean to our friend Daniel, who's now lived through not just changes of kings, of administrations. He's lived now through entire replacements of empires. So that's a good question, right? So if he's in part of the exile, the group that's brought in from Judah, he would have been exiled. He would have been brought in around 600 BCE. This is taking place during the time, let's say it's during the time of Cyrus, which we just saw was about 550. So this is about 50 years later, which makes Daniel about a 50 or 60-year-old guy at this point. Okay, so he definitely could have lived through it. He's a young man when he's brought in, but it says that Darius was about 62 at the time. I mean, maybe they're talking about Koresh. Again, Cyrus, we don't know. But this is the king, the new empire, the new empire. Just like it's just there. Like again, normally if this is a history book, we want to know what happened. What happened? How did these guys take over? This book doesn't care. No, no, but this one in particular is like that's why people call it historical fiction because they don't seem to care. Like the fact that Esther, there's no record of a queen whose name is Esther, who's Jewish, who's not Persian. We just don't have that record. Okay, fine. So what? It's a little embellishment. This is a problem for people because there's no basis for it. Now, were there stories about a Jewish courtier who lived in Babylon and then made her way through the Persians who this is based around? Maybe, but that's not even the issue because when we read next week, these stories are just the setup for the prophecies. These stories are just like dressing for it's the whipped cream that you eat before you eat the actual dessert, which is what you're going to see next week in the chapters. But here it is. Here's the scene that we all love. Well, I love. A lot of people love this scene. This is what happens.
It pleased Darius to appoint over the kingdom 120 satraps to be in charge of the whole kingdom.
Yeah, the Hashverosh thing, right? The 100 there, it's 127, but it's like the same thing. It's like 120 there. It's a big empire.
Over them were 3 ministers, one of them Daniel, to whom these satraps reported in order that the king not be troubled.
So it seems like maybe Daniel's still one of the 3. He's like a triumvirate, and he's like the 3. They're like the division is like there's 3 vice presidents that report to the president, if you will. Yeah.
This man, Daniel, surpassed the other ministers and satraps by virtue of his extraordinary spirit, and the king considered setting him over the whole kingdom. The ministers and satraps looked for some fault in Daniel's conduct in matters of state, but they could find neither fault nor corruption, inasmuch as he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him.
Yeah. And when I say vice president, I'm not talking about like vice president of a country. I'm talking like vice president of the company, because this seems like some stuff that was going on in the boardroom or in the back room, whatever, where the other vice presidents don't like the one vice president because the president really likes that vice president, that VP, and he's like, I'm going to give him even more than the other 2. So this is making the other VPs feel panicked, and this happens in companies all the time.
Those men then said, "We are not going to find any fault with this Daniel, unless we find something against him in connection with the laws of his God."
Oof.
Then these ministers and satraps came thronging into the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the ministers of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, companions, and governors are in agreement that a royal ban should be issued under sanction of an oath that whoever shall address a petition to anyone, divine or human, besides you, O king, during the next 30 days, shall be thrown into a lion's den."
Yeah, that's the setup, right? There's the setup. You're not allowed to address a petition to anyone, divine or human, besides you. Well, that's insane, right? Yeah, you're only people can ask you for things, King. Otherwise, you go into the lines then.
So issue the ban, O king, and put it in writing, so that it be unalterable as a law of the Medes and Persians, that may not be abrogated. Thereupon King Darius put the ban in writing. When Daniel learned that it had been put in writing, he went to his house, in whose upper chamber he had had windows made facing Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he knelt down, prayed, and made confession to his God, as he had always done.
So this is a key line, right? For many reasons. But it sounds a little bit like Esther here, right? It sounds a little bit like Esther. The Persians making rules that can't be broken. Right? Made a rule, you can't go, you can't change it. So that seems to be something that the Persians were known for. But again, we don't have record that the Persians made rules that they couldn't change, but whatever. They made serious rules. But what, of course, is so impressive about what happens in what we just read is the rabbis point to this. Again, it's not like we use Daniel a lot for like quotes, but this line is important because the rabbis say this is where we see that Jews were already praying 3 times a day. Now, if this was written not that long ago, wasn't that weird, right? So if this was written in 164, 165 BCE, then yeah, Jews were praying. They were praying 3 times a day. And guess what? They had synagogues already, folks. Even though there was still a temple in Jerusalem, there was a synagogue in their communities in some places. We found them. They date back before this. Well, depends. No, facing Jerusalem from where he would have been facing west. He's in Persia, right? So he'd be facing west. But it still says that he's facing Jerusalem. So that's the other part, right, Mike? Is that not only is he praying 3 times a day, but he's praying towards Jerusalem, which shows that the Jewish tradition was there already. So whenever it's from, it's old, and it's definitely older than the temple, which means that people were praying towards the temple in the other places they lived in their own places. Or okay, it established it, but it's definitely old, and it's definitely something that Jews felt comfortable at least admitting to, or honestly, it's a problem admitting to it. But when this was written, let's say it was written by Jews who lived in Israel, it doesn't matter. It shows that they knew or they believed that even people hundreds of years ago did it. And again, they wrote it in 164, so they're definitely writing it while the temple is still there. There's no one argues that. So however late this was, we have copies of Daniel that are 150 BC. We have copies of Daniel from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The book was there. So people knew that already people were praying not in the temple. They were praying towards Jerusalem, and they were praying 3 times a day. And again, this, of course, is going to get him in trouble.
Then those men came thronging in and found Daniel petitioning his God in supplication. They then approached the king and reminded him of the royal ban. Did you not put in writing a ban that whoever addresses a petition to anyone, divine or human, besides you, O king, during the next 30 days, shall be thrown into a lion's den? The king said in reply, the order stands firm as a law of the Medes and Persians that may not be abrogated. Thereupon they said to the king, Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, pays no heed to you, O king, or to the ban that you put in writing. 3 times a day he offers his petitions to his God.
So they set him up. They set him up. They got the king to approve this ordinance, and now they've set up Daniel. It's crazy. It's a full-on setup. And he's not just doing it once. He didn't do it once. He does it 3 times every day. Of course, he's praying. They turned it around. They turned him on. They turned it around on him. Yeah.
Upon hearing that, the king was very disturbed, and he set his heart upon saving Daniel, and until the sun set, made every effort to rescue him. Then those men that came thronging into the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that any ban that the king issues under sanction of oath is unalterable.
Yeah, so he doesn't want to do it, but he's caught. He passed a rule and now he has to follow his own rule. So they caught him. They caught the king. They made him, they forced his hand.
By the king's order, Daniel was then brought and thrown into the lion's den. The king spoke to Daniel and said, Your God, whom you serve so regularly, will deliver you.
So people forget this part of the story. The Daniel story is like one of the most famous stories in the Bible. Like it's taught to kids. It's not actually, it's a little bit more, I think it's used more in Christian texts than it is in Jewish texts or Jewish teachings for some reason. But this idea that God will save us from really dangerous situations, it's part of our consciousness. I remember it in Bible books that I had as a kid. But yeah, it's a very dramatic scene. Daniel in the lion's den. You just say in the lion's den. People know when you say I'm in the lion's den, they know you're in a dangerous situation. But people forget. They forget that the king doesn't want to do it. And not only that, he gives them words of encouragement. You're going to be okay. Your God will save you. So he's like, believes it. The king already is like, you're going to be okay. Maybe he really hopes it. He's not 100% sure, but that's what he said.
A rock was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his signet and with the signet of his nobles, so that nothing might be altered concerning Daniel. The king then went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and his sleep fled from him. Then, at the first light of dawn, the king arose and rushed to the lion's den. As he approached the den, he cried to Daniel in a mournful voice. The king said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, was the God whom you served so regularly able to deliver you from the lions? Daniel then talked with the king. O king, live forever. My God sent an angel who shut the mouths of the lions so that they did not injure me, inasmuch as I was deemed to be innocent. Nor have I, O king, done you any injury.
Wow. And so you can see here that Daniel is okay because the angel came and took care of the lions, made sure the lions didn't hurt him. So the lions would have hurt him, but they didn't because there was an angel there. So it's not like the angels were like, it wasn't like the lions calmed down. They had no choice because there was an angel there protecting him. The angel kept him safe. And of course, it's all good. He's still alive. It's a miracle. He was closed up. There was no way he could get out. He's been there all night, all day. He wakes up. He's still there. Interestingly, by the way, this whole story is really told from this point of view of the king. It's not really told from Daniel. It's like, what was going on in Daniel's mind? We really don't know. He's telling the story to the king. It's all told from the standpoint of the king. And people forget that. The king is really the one who is amazed by the miracle. He's the one who couldn't sleep. He's the one who's worried about his advisor. So it's an interesting little part of this that people forget. And Daniel says, it's all good. It's all good.
The king was very glad and ordered Daniel to be brought up out of the den. Daniel was brought up out of the den, and no injury was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. Then, by order of the king, those men who had slandered Daniel were brought, and together with their children and wives, were thrown into the lion's den. They had hardly reached the bottom of the den when the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones.
Yeah, that part of the story people forget. Sometimes they're taught. Wait, I don't even remember that part of the story. I just remember he came out of the den and everything was okay. Sometimes I don't even think I was taught that they threw the bad guys into the den as punishment. What I definitely don't remember as a kid. Oh, and the kids got thrown in. Their kids got thrown in too. Whoa, I don't remember that part. Yeah, their wives and kids get to be thrown in. They get to be punished as well. And they barely hit the ground and they get eaten up. Yeah, that part. Yeah, that part that we don't usually tell the kids. And that's not the end of the story because here's the happy ending.
Then King Darius wrote to all peoples and nations of every language that inhabit the earth, may your well being abound. I have hereby given an order that throughout my royal domain every one must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel, for this is the living God who endures forever, whose kingdom is indestructible, and whose dominion is to the end of time, who delivers and saves and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth by having delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Thus Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and during the reign of Cyrus the Persian.
Yeah. And that is the way that first part ends. Perfect place for us to break. Because next week we'll come back and we'll read the visions of Daniel, which are a whole nother set of it's a whole nother deal. So and it's really the setup. The parts that we read just now set up the prophecies that we're gonna get hit with. But again, it says that Daniel kind of ruled all the way through to King Cyrus, which would be, another 20 years later. And uh, it's all good because again, that's Cyrus would be the king who lets the Jews go back, and he's really the king that we know of, who's mentioned in the Bible. So, yeah, that is the beginning of Daniel, the first half, and we will read the next half next week. And if you want to, you can read the additions to the book of Daniel, which are more like this part of Daniel. They're more like the Daniel of the stories. And some of them don't deal with Daniel at all, but they're stories. They're not prophecies. So the one edition we talked about, Daniel chapter 3 editions, which is the prayer, and then the rest of it is going to be the Daniel the Daniel prophecies, which is what we're going to read over the next week, maybe 2 weeks. All right, everybody. Thank you. Take care. And hopefully we will, probably be the 2 weeks. We will see you soon. Thank you, Rosemary, for
Thank you.
taking us through the Daniel and the lion's den. So if any of you find yourself in a lion's den or something equally scary, we hope that you're safe and that you emerge unscathed. No scathing. All right. Take care. Thanks, everybody.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye.